Today's backdrop is on what to do with the budget surplus. Early this year, the Bipartisan Legislative Fiscal Bureau announced a projected $3.8 billion budget surplus at the end of the 21-23 biennium two-year budget, which we're almost halfway through. So the end of this current budget is next summer. And at that time, we'll have an entire $1 billion more in surplus than they thought would happen last summer. And politicians, of course, wasted no time announcing what they intended to do with the surplus, as if it were some windfall. Fortunately, the governor's rebate plan was quashed by the legislature. Republicans, of course, dogmatically advocated to give the money back to taxpayers. And of course, they always want to do that in the form of tax cuts to the wealthiest individuals and corporations. So how do we start backdropping this? One way would be to think about how would people handle an unanticipated increase in revenues in a business or some other aspect of our lives. I reported to the presidents of two publicly traded companies in my career, so I could imagine what would happen if a major corporation suddenly had several $billion more than they anticipated. How would they spend the money? And of course, they wouldn't spend it. They would just, nothing would change. They would continue to evaluate in a very disciplined way every possible way that they could invest capital pursuant to the corporation's investment criteria and the expected rate of return and financial risk and how they see their role in their industry, things like that. So if they couldn't, they might make a decision to pay a dividend to the shareholders, and then that would send a big message to the shareholders. We couldn't figure out how to better invest the money, but they wouldn't do that in some reactive or dogmatic way in any manufacturer, bank, insurance company. They're always managing money in a very professional way, and we all expect that. So why we can't expect that from politicians and candidates, I don't know. So another way to frame this is in a longer term economic forecast, not just a current budget cycle, so or period. So we can look at the 2022 February, one of the current forecasts, Department of Revenue. So yes, the economy does have a positive forecast right now. This is a function of tax cuts, unanticipated tax revenues, the COVID relief, which ends in 2024. That's a consideration for this too. We really need to think about all of this from a big picture perspective. The economy is reopened. But if there was ever a time to be fiscally conservative, I would argue that this is one of those times. Not that I don't always think we should be fiscally conservative, but we have the potential economic impacts of the war in Ukraine. Inflation now could trigger a recession. We don't know what is going to happen as the Fed tries to control that. The pandemic might not be over. Other things to really consider too in this surplus is that the state is responsible to maintain minimum levels of education, state spending on education in order for the state to continue to be eligible for $2 billion in federal education funding during this budget period. We also know that the supply chain hasn't returned to normal. So there's just lots of things we should be thinking about from a big picture standpoint. And this is always important because how we manage the state fiscally will affect our ability to invest in everything that the state funds on an ongoing basis, including road maintenance, healthcare, education, social services, broadband, everything. So in my view, anyone in government advocating any use of surplus funds should always be expected to support their position with a well-reasoned argument framed in a long-term economic plan and not just the current budget. So our team, for example, is preparing a comprehensive economic plan with a focus on how to specifically mediate Wisconsin's ongoing two structural challenges, which are rural and urban poverty, which I consider to be ongoing, serious drags on our economic health and our prospects for economic growth.